Good morning, everybody. So thank you for coming to this meeting early morning. We have a really exciting and packed panel, so I want to get started. I'm not going to say very much as a start because we have so much to cover today. But just to say that we all know that we need to scale up financing for the SDGs, particularly in developing countries. And those of us who have been working on these issues and spending the past few days talking about financing for development also know that we're in a period of very high risk, particularly debt risks. So I think we're talking both about instruments and ways to scale up financing while also addressing the risks we have, including linked to high debt. And so we have together today both investors, government officials, and international system people to come up with the solutions to this, both in thinking about how do we use and scale up SDG bonds as an instrument, but also can we use integrated national financing frameworks to bring policymaking together to both think about raising funds and also managing risks in a cohesive way. So with that, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today, and I'm going to start by inviting Mr. Jean-Hua Ri, our USG, the Undersecretary General of UNDESA, to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Shari. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join this side event on the sovereign bond. Let me just share a few observations on behalf of the Secretariat. The need to realign and refocus development financing has never been more urgent. The last few years have been marked by a series of interlinked challenges. A faster-paced pandemic halted the economies overnight. The compounding socio-economic impact of the war in Ukraine led to the rising of the cost of living. And the risk of the widespread debt crisis is a real and a growing threat. The general response to these crises has lacked ambition. Short-term solutions put in place will make the situation worse in the long run and further compromise our efforts to achieve the sustainable development goals. Capital needs to go where it's needed most. That's why the Secretary General introduced an SDG stimulus. The stimulus plan that has called for injecting at least $500 billion per year for the SDG action through a combination of the concessional and the non-concessional finance. This call to action, if answered, would fund renewable energy solutions, modern infrastructure, sustainable food systems, and the digital connectivity at a larger scale. The SDG stimulus plan encourages leveraging of the innovative debt instruments to finance sustainable development, a pathway towards growing interest among the member states, among the governments, and IFIs. We have to enhance the integrity and the quality of these instruments. This can be done by supporting credible and transparent measurement and reporting, and better aligned with the SDGs. We need an objective assessment of this growing market that identifies lessons and best practices from both countries and the investors' experiences. We have to encourage responsible and efficient use of these instruments. Dear colleagues, dear friends, that's why we are gathered here today, to explore the ways to better harness the potential of the SDG bonds. Of course, there are limitations attached to this nascent market, including the hurdles of the debt distress, technical capacity, and the limited accountability. But the internal community is working on exploring and overcome these issues. Right now, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance is working with the UNDESA and the UNDP to provide guidance to enhance the sovereign bonds market. This work that will consolidate lessons learned and the best practices so far in the issuance of the SDG-linked sovereign bonds. It would also feature the concrete and the practical recommendations from the perspective of the investors for enhancing the integrity of the future SDG-linked sovereign bond issuance. The recently launched Financing for Sustainable Development Report 2023 also makes important recommendations to improve this market. It proposes tax incentives for issuers and the investors and the mechanisms for the mitigating risks. Right now, the bulk of the thematic bonds have been issued in developed economies. To make them successful in developing countries will require more effective and targeted incentives. Development partners could also introduce blended finance mechanisms to lower the financing cost of these bonds, or link their issuance to the technical assistance, investment management, and adherence to the standards and the guidelines. For governments, these instruments are an effective strategy to signal their commitment to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, of course. Enhancing integrity and the credibility of these thematic bonds will attract more invested interests. In closing, let me say thank you once again for participating in this rich dialogue. I look forward to the outcome of your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lee, for those very excellent opening remarks to get us started. And I'd now like to pass the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Claver Katete, the PR from the Permanent Representative from Rwanda to the UN, for his opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sherry. I think you've been occupying me for the last 2 days, waking me up early in the morning. And you have to pay for that. Thank you so much. Now, we are in a situation that is very, very unique. We are in a situation that is very, very serious. We have never had this situation before, where we have had back-to-back very big global shocks. We had a pandemic that lasted for so many, of course, for years, not 1 year. We've also had the war that keeps going in Ukraine. Both of them have had very, very serious impact. During the COVID, many countries actually had to borrow beyond their capacity because they had to save lives. This is a situation that affected everyone. And by doing that, they are heavily indebted. And as of 2 months ago, we are counting 66 countries that are either highly indebted or in debt distress. Some of them are paying every month, every year, the amount of money that is almost equivalent to their recurrent expenditure, meaning they have no fiscal space. And by paying that amount of money, what that means is that you are paying it in foreign currency, you are drawing down your reserves, means you have no capacity to intervene on the market for people who are importing goods and services. And that has an impact on the currency, it has an impact on accelerating the inflation. So these countries are in a very serious situation. But at the same time, the ODA has declined. The aid is now 61 billion. Foreign direct investment on the African continent is only 83 billion. Yesterday I was saying, compared to India, India is 84 billion, just India. But for Africa, it's 83 billion. So we are basically relying on the remittances, which is 96 billion that is coming. There's no other way. There's no other sources. Countries are in a so difficult situation. How do we talk about SDGs in terms of implementation? Because there's no fiscal space to be able to do that. And that's why this bond comes really very handy, the SDG bond. And this one, if it is well structured, in such a way that it can be able to bring in not only the government resources from different countries, but also attract money from the private sector, attract money from the philanthropy, and then have the social component in such a way that really it is highly subsidized. That way it would allow many countries to be able to invest. And you could do it at the central government level, but also the municipal bonds would have the component of the SDG bonds. And that's the only way that people would be attracted and be sure that you are spending the money for SDG projects. That way it would have a very significant impact. And this can be well structured. It has been done many times in terms of structuring bonds, whether it is social bonds, whether it is green bonds or other bonds that are going to impact heavily on the SDG. If we do it properly, we make this one here, we believe it could have a significant impact. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those comments to get us started. And then as well, the next speaker will be Ms. Anna Karin Ennerstrom, who is the permanent representative of Sweden to the UN, to also give opening remarks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and I'd like to start by welcoming all of you to this important event on the SDG sovereign bonds and how we can channel investment to where they are most needed. And we're very happy to co-host this event together with Rwanda, and I'm very glad that my very good friend and colleague, permanent representative of Rwanda, Ambassador Clever Gatete, is here. We are also co-hosting with UNDP and with UNDESA, to ensure that a resilient recovery from the economic downturn and achieve the SDGs, innovative financing and new forms of partnership with private sector and investors are needed. I think Ambassador Clever have given you the background and also emphasized that we are in the middle of a crisis for development where flows to developing countries are showing a negative trend. And at the same time, asset managers hold approximately $126 trillion in assets. The good news is that investors, such as you that are present here today, show interest in developing countries. However, some investors also point out the lack of easy access to those investment and the lack of investable pipelines. Sweden is working closely with the investors through the Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development and Global Investor for Sustainable Development, the GISD. And GISD has recommended countries to issue SDG sovereign bonds. At the same time, countries are starting to work with the INFFs, Integrated National Finance Frameworks, where many countries aim to access the international financial markets. The INFS are supported by Team Europe, European Union and its member states in close collaboration with the United Nations. And last year, Sweden, together with UNDESA and UNDP, gathered countries, GISD investors and the World Bank to discuss investments for SDGs. At today's event, we hope the discussion will be a kickoff for the work of SDG sovereign bonds in practical terms. We see that well-designed SDG sovereign bonds can release assets for where they are needed the most and for sustainable development. We see the potential for countries to finance also social SDG bonds in addition to the green SDG bonds. And a lot of work is yet to be done around the debt transparency, the design and reporting, and that will be discussed in the panels today. So I will close while wishing you a very fruitful discussion today, and I look forward to taking part of the results and conclusions. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. And I think we're in a really good place to get started. We have 3 different panels. So we're going to start with a panel looking at some of the country experiences. Then we're going to look from the investor perspective. And then we're going to look finally at some of the incentive structures that can be and how to design these to make them work even better. So we're going to start with 2 country examples. We have an example from both Rwanda and from Indonesia. And so we will start with Dr. Wandwar Nugroho. I'm not doing very well with names this morning. who is from Indonesia to speak about the Indonesian experience. And really what we want to understand is what needs are identified in the process of issuing and reporting on SDG sovereign bonds, and how can it connect, and does it connect to the Integrated National Financing Framework process or other country processes. So over to you, the expert coordinator at the National Secretariat of Sustainable Development Goals and Implementation in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Shari. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, very good morning to all of you. Well, actually, we prepare quite, I would say, presentations for this, but I know that the time is limited. So there are two things that I would like to start with. One, we already prepared all the projects that's bankable, investable, everything. But in order to save paper, we prepare this QR code. So anyone interested in this, I will be ready here. And also by 10:30, I will be roaming around Vienna Cafe here to answer any questions about Indonesia. But basically, what I want to share with you in 2 minutes, because Shari only gave me 2 minutes before the discussion, is that prior to the issuance of this Government of Indonesia, we call it SDGs bond, actually we already developed a securities framework to ensure that the proceeds of the SDGs bond are directed to the most appropriate projects. You can see in the screen all the eligible SDGs expenditures. In this project, we put everything here, the location of the project, amount of the project, who are responsible for this, estimated project cost, and everything else that I hope will be suitable for all parties who are interested in investing there. So the project criteria, as we can see here, covers indicators such as how it ensure long-term impacts, and then all SDG securities issued under this framework are aligned with international standards, including the ICMA, International Capital Market Association principles. The Government of Indonesia is committed to adhering to the highest international standards of external reviews for the SDG securities, in line with best practices and obtaining assurance on post-issuance annual reporting. I prepared 2 slides, so the next one, if you may. Second, the question is about integrating this with overall national strategy. So the financing strategy is at the core of an integrated national financing framework, INFF. Marcos is here. Marcos has been following closely what we do with Indonesia, INFF. In fact, including mapping of this investor, we call it investor map, right, Marcos, for this. So this provides a path for financing national development strategies and plan. So if you look at that, those are the impacts of SDGs Bond 2021. If we consider the substantial fiscal gap in SDGs financing in Indonesia alone, to achieve SDGs until 2030, the financing gap is around $1 trillion. So I agree with Ambassador Katete that we need to mobilize money not only from the state but also from the private sector, and I think this is one of the way. So I think this is important, and we align it with national priorities. If you look at that, at least for example in the health, education, and ICT, these are the 3 examples that we did with the 2021 bonds. I think, Shari, I will stop here because I believe we will engage in a more detailed discussion. So this is just to start to kick off the discussion how we in Indonesia implement this idea through this SDGs bond.
Great, thank you so much. That was great, and I will have a follow-up question. But first, I think we're going to go to the case of Rwanda to give an introductory remark from Ambassador Katete.
Yeah, me again. Thank you so much. We studied this issue very seriously in Rwanda and wanted to make sure that we combine. We are a country that has, they call it a land of southern hills. So being mountainous, you can imagine the issue of environment and climate change. It's very, very serious in Rwanda. For some of you who have been there, either you are going up or you're going down. There's no other way. You can imagine even constructing houses, doing projects, doing agriculture with erosion and other things. The climate is something very, very important. Now, we tried some time back. We established a green fund in the country. We started with DFID, the UK government, and then we got other donors to participate. But then we had to also realize that everything is almost needs some kind of green element in terms of financing. You find if it is energy, if it is housing, if it is agriculture, almost anything. And we had to say, okay, we have to do it differently. We created what you call the IREME Fund. We put it in the central bank, I mean the Development Bank of Rwanda. We brought in almost all the other partners, the KfW, we brought in the French Development Fund, we brought in the UK CDC, we brought in the Germans, almost every country in Europe that you could think of. We are bringing the ones from the Asia, and we are saying as a government, let's also participate. We've been used to the way of government going to the World Bank, going to the IMF, and then mobilizing resources that go and implemented by the central government. But this time, we also had the element of the resilience and sustainability facility that we had. We are the first country with the IMF to have that, because we wanted to combine development and also climate change, but also wanted to focus on SDGs. So what we did is to put a pool of money together, including the government borrowing, this time not the central government, but putting it in that fund. Because you can borrow long term, once you got the World Bank IDA resources of 0.75% for 40 years with 10 years grace period, it's cheap compared to what the private sector can be able to borrow from the commercial banks. What we did was to have this combination of funds which would make the cost lower and which would go to de-risk the private sector projects, so that the projects, instead of the private sector going to borrow on a commercial basis, which is very, very expensive, then this money would be able to de-risk that and then have the projects financed cheaply and focusing it on all the areas of SDGs. So this was very, very important for us to be able to have that combination of funds, not just one fund that we borrow, but you also had to bring in others, the development funds, and some of the grants from some of the bilaterals, so that we can have that kind of combination. And once you have it, it's cheap. And it helps in terms of either co-investment or de-risking projects, and that would help in terms of getting the scale that we want in all the areas. And this has been very helpful for us, and we're encouraging you to also join us in terms of if you have extra penny, just put it in that fund. It will find its way in SDG implementation in Rwanda. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So there are two very different examples, and both really interesting, of bringing development finance together with the SDGs. One of a bond of instruments, and then the other for this fund, which maybe one day even the fund could consider raising money through an SDG bond as well. So it's an interesting, two really interesting examples. Just to quickly start with a follow-up for Indonesia, because so your PowerPoint is really interesting because you really link to impact. And one of the questions of SDG bonds is how do we know and how do we monitor where the money actually goes? And I know you started with a whole budgeting process. So maybe you could give some thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shari. In Indonesia, what we do is we have this national wide strategy in what we call SDGs tagging. So every year in the Ministry of National Planning, we work together with the Ministry of Finance. We tag government projects or government activities. We call it national priorities, which link directly to SDGs. So with this tagging, we know exactly how much money are spent for what purpose, the outcomes. Because I think one challenge, and I think we all know that government works with outputs usually, rather than with outcomes. So we need to make sure that the aggregate of those outputs actually contribute to the achievement of the outcomes, which SDGs want. So learning from that, that's what we do with the SDGs bond as well. So we have the so-called eligible projects to be financed through bonds, because we have, of course, to be responsible and to be accountable to the investors. We need to ensure that their money goes to the right projects with certain impact. So the way we do it, we link, and because it is also supervised by the Indonesia Fiscal Authority, so we can link directly to the national project. So this is how we do it in Indonesia. I know that different countries may have different strategies, but in Indonesia, so far, we are still quite new with this. But so far, this is what works. Of course, there are plenty of rooms for improvement. And I'd love to hear from other countries and maybe perspective from investors or from other parties. Thank you.
Thanks. And in terms of Rwanda, so how do you think about, you have the fund and you're thinking about using it for projects. Are you trying to link, and how do you monitor or think about the impact of that on the SDGs? Or is that less important from your perspective?
I think the way we do it in Rwanda is different. The president doesn't like anything other than results. So it's not a matter of paperwork like the way we normally do it. In Rwanda, it's the results. If we are talking about results, we measure it. And if you go to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, the first thing that they do, and they present to cabinet and parliament, because it's not only the cabinet that holds you accountable this time in Rwanda, it's the parliament, which says you have SDGs, you signed on them, and we need to see results every year. So there you have to present it as a separate package, not only the money from this one, but also the money that we invest from the government, and also what the private sector invests in. So we have to show results every year. We have to present it. So ours is different, is that you must do it. And not only that, you must identify to say in all the areas what has been achieved this year compared to last year. Mm-hmm. So regardless of where the money is coming from. But the other one, the pool of the money, which we are doing with so many institutions contributing, including even the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others that are putting in money, we want to make sure that we have the scale so that we can have as many projects as possible, supplementing what the government is investing in already. Because it does not stop the government because you have this one for SDGs. No. It is also supplements what the government is doing in all the areas. But this one here is really looking at where there are weaknesses, where there are gaps, and then to fill that gap. And we are doing it together with the steering committee of the government and development partners together. So for us, the impact is the most important. Forget about how much you put in. Is what did it get? What did you get out of that? So,
and I think that that's really great, because you also really underscored the importance of planning in this process and how you're linking the spending to the planning process, which again very much links to the whole purpose of an integrated national financing framework. So I think we can really see these two different elements coming together. So,
if I can just add, and it's all linked also to the legal part. If, for example, it is housing, we put it in the law that how the houses, the greening part, how we measure it, and all that. We have the GGG in the government. It's part of the Ministry of Infrastructure. They actually help us in terms of setting standards and supervision of how that greening is taking place. If it is energy, if it is road construction, if it is anything, that one is measured. So, and at the same time, there is a legal part of it, of how you do it. It's not just doing it. And this has been really very successful for us.
No, that's really great. And it really, again, goes to the formulation of an integrated national financing framework, whether we call it that or not, because that really is thinking about what are the needs, and then where are the biggest gaps? How are we going to target them? What instruments do we use, which brings in the SDG bond, and then in some cases, and then the accountability side of it. How do we follow up and monitor to make sure that it's having impact? So I think that these two examples are really great in bringing together both the financing instruments we're here to discuss, and then the planning process and why it's so important to have these working together. And so thank you both so much. I think we're only a few minutes behind our tight schedule, and we're going to move to the next panel. And so we're going to move now to the investor panel. And I want to thank our Undersecretary General, Mr. Lee, for joining us this morning. On the panel from the investor perspective, we have quite a few investors here this morning, and I'll introduce you as we go through the questions to save time. And the main question is, from an investor perspective, why are you interested in SDG sovereign bonds? And then also, how do you see these as different from regular bonds? Do you see them as different? What are the differences you see? And then also, what about you from your perspective in terms of thinking about monitoring the outcomes? Is that important to you? And if so, how do you do that? And so we'll start with our first, with Stephanie von Friedberg, the Managing Director of Global Public Sector at Citibank, where I used to work. So Stephanie, there you are, over to you.
I'm over here, yeah. I've been there for all of 100 days. I spent 30 years at the World Bank and just joined Citi. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's lovely to have an opportunity to talk about sustainable bonds. I do think that a lot has actually happened since the billions to trillions conversation started in Addis. And I dug through a bunch of Citi numbers over the weekend, and there's been a tenfold increase in sustainable bonds between 2016 and 2021, where in 2021, almost $1 trillion worth of bonds were issued. So we're moving in the right direction, but I think, Ambassador Katate, you're absolutely right. We're woefully off course to meet the SDGs, and we really need to double down. I think there's 3 things that we would want countries and companies to be focusing on as they're thinking about sustainable bonds. First, I think it would be very useful to have advisors create bonds that are linked to one SDG, and from that one SDG, a very specific set of KPIs that can be measured and can be reported on. I think, Sherry, it goes back to what you were asking about transparency, the efficacy of the bonds themselves, and are they actually reaching and having impact? So that's one thing that we would suggest. A second thing is that we really need to begin to pay attention to regulation. Because if we look, for example, at the transparency regulation that's coming out of the EU, that's going to drive more and more investors to want to hold sustainable bonds. So the demand is going to grow, and we need to be increasing supply as that demand comes on stream. And then finally, I think this is where Sida is going to be really important. So 60% of the bonds that were issued last year were issued in emerging markets, but 72% of the proceeds went to the developed world. So the only way we're going to move those proceeds to emerging markets to meet the SDGs and to really help in the energy transition is to work with donors so that we can blend and de-risk. We've done, in the World Bank Group, quite a bit with Sida on this. Sida's really leaned in, but I think we need all of the donors to begin to think about how do we use donor financing to be more accretive to the bond structures.
Great, that was very succinct and very insightful. So we're going to now go to Gavin Power, the Executive Vice President of PIMCO. And I know that PIMCO has been advocating for SDG sovereign bonds for some time, and I'd really love to hear what interest you're seeing from your customers. Are they interested in pricing at a discount, a premium? What are their thoughts on this? And do you see this as part of to be incorporated into a bigger portfolio, or are you thinking about SDG portfolios that are including SDG bonds, as well as anything else you'd like to say?
Thanks, Sherry. And thanks for this invitation. It's wonderful to see so many old friends and colleagues. It warms the heart. Maybe just 2 caveats as I begin. First, I think any discussion around innovations such as sovereign bonds has to be framed within the parameters of debt sustainability. We discussed global debt distress issues already. And second, just to note that my comments don't represent any sort of official PIMCO market or economic forecast. I'm not here to move markets or pricing today. This said, the GSD Alliance today is excited to announce with UNDP the launch of a new work stream and initiative on sovereign SDG bonds. That is sustainability bonds that are aligned to priority SDGs and official targets. GSD members really do see a significant potential in helping to build a global market in sovereign SDG-aligned bonds to address the financing gap. We've heard 2 great examples today. The sovereign market remains very small as compared to the corporate market, and 3 related points in that regard. First, GSD and I think investors generally really see an evolution from sort of traditional ESG risk management strategies towards something around outcomes and impact and SDGs. And here I think it's really exciting to consider SDGs as a new asset class, potentially. Secondly, I think the corporate sustainability bond market is instructive in this regard. It's now measured in the trillions of dollars in terms of total cumulative issuance, and a subset of that, sustainability-linked bonds, which didn't exist 3 years ago, now total close to 200 billion. So I think the corporate market is very interesting as we consider sovereign market and the space. And lastly, just to note that the point on integrated national financing frameworks, I think, is really crucial. That is anchoring this work in the national plans so that we are working with countries and member states that have strategies that fall within the parameters of debt sustainability. In terms of our own view of these instruments, I mean, one is that we want to see the linkages to SDG targets and indicators. We like second-party opinions and verification and annual reporting where possible. And really, making that strong link to the global goals as opposed to sort of what we've seen before, which is sort of general green bond issuance. So I think tying this really firmly into the official targets and indicators becomes really important. And lastly, Sherry, just to put note on impact and measurement, this is going to be critically important as we look at this market. And there, I think we need to be mindful about incorporating do no harm principles, the Global Compact 10 principles, for instance, thinking about the notion of net positive outcomes, that is, incorporating, considering negative impacts in addition to the positive outcomes.
And can I ask you, are you seeing something similar to what Stephanie was mentioning, that there's interest in specific SDGs, bonds linked to very specific ones? And if so, which areas would be most interesting, do you think?
I mean, for us, obviously, climate action, adaptation, mitigation adaptation remains sort of the dominant theme. That said, in terms of the just transition, linkages to decent work, to the transition, the employment implications, gender equality is another important aspect, poverty alleviation, generally speaking, health education. So I was excited to see the example of Indonesia and the links to social themes. So our hope is that we see an expansion in these instruments beyond just the climate agenda, as important as that is. And I really think it's important as we think about Dubai and COP28 to not lose the connection between climate action in Paris and the social SDGs. And I think we're in danger of that happening to some extent.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm going to go now to Niels Bolmstrand, the CEO of Nordea Asset Management and the GISD representative from Sida, from the Swedish Investor Network, SISD. And again, your organization is an asset manager, so you sort of need liquidity for many of your instruments. And so where do you think SDG sovereign bonds fit into your portfolio?
Hello? You hear me? Thank you. So I'd like to start with saying that the asset management industry and the asset owner industry are quite different in the needs that we have, and the challenges that faces us, all of us now, are so great, and the amounts that we need to raise are so great that we need standardization. If you're going to unlock the vast pool of assets that sits within the private, it needs to be standardized. For as long as we're trying to find only one investor investing into one project, the numbers are not going to become that great. And from this perspective, we see the sovereign side as really, really interesting, because there you can collect several investors. You can, by that, also create liquidity for the investors, and by that, you will unlock the true power of the private capital as well. At the same time, having said that, we've had for many years I think about it as two bodies of water slushing around the world. We have the private capital. It's slushing around and it's looking for returns, and it's been doing that throughout times. On the other side, we have the public capital that is available that is also slushing around, but it's purely looking for impact, and it's been looking for impact throughout history as well. And we've now started building canals between this, if you want to call it freshwater and seawater, but we've still failed to create the brackish water. We still failed to actually build a pipeline in between these where we can do this at scale. Because the reality is that we are now in a very different economic environment. It means that we price risk, and we price risk on behalf of our clients, which means that we need to find this way of cooperating if we're going to be able to finance projects or debt in areas that we find riskier. And we need to build, that's about the rule of law, it's about the mature institutions, and we need to find and be able to use the public money to actually de-risk the private money if that is going to succeed, and it needs to be done at scale if we're truly going to be able to unlock the potential in this.
Great, that's really, I love your metaphor, and I guess the public sector is the private sector is the ocean, the salt water, and the public sector is the clean water. So, sorry? Sure, go ahead.
He's saying something that is very, very important, because just going to look at one project, another project, is going to, standardization is very, very important. Mm-hmm. But there is a point that he's mentioning, because I was also a minister of infrastructure, and I did quite a lot of de-risking. And one of the issues that is very, very important, even for the response of these resources, is to make sure that the government uses their own money to de-risk, so that it becomes more attractive for this money, especially for the return. So once you take on the risk, it's a small amount of money, but the impact is so great that you can even use some of the pension money, you can use any kind of resources, because you can measure and see that the risk is not so great. And once you have that kind of understanding that the government is going to participate in terms of the risking, then the money would go directly to implement in specific areas without taking much of the risk. And that's very, very important for any investor.
So I think we're really hitting on the importance of public and private sector working together, whatever the instruments. And then thinking, we're running out of, we don't have much time, but I still have a question for you on the instrument itself. Because I think that definitely how do we do blending better than we've been doing it is a really big question for us all to consider, because going forward for the next halfway to 2030. But one question, would you not be able to, or not want to participate in an SDG bond until it's more liquid, until there's a liquid market, or would you be willing to go in early to help create a liquid market?
So this is where it differs what assets you have behind you. So as an asset manager, my clients have promised to keep their money with me all the time until tomorrow. And my legislator has told me that if you want to stay out of jail, you should be able to liquidate those assets by tomorrow to hand them back. So it's a question of the legislator, the supervisor, working together, but it is also a question of finding how do we come together? How do we use not only the freshwater money, but also the pension money, because we have others, and we have others represented here as well today, that have almost they look at their money for perpetuity on the pension side. So if we can blend all of this together, it's not just public and private, it is also private, and the difference between our assets.
Great, no, thanks, that's very helpful, and we'll get to one in a second, though first we're going to go to Bank of America. But I do have to say, I used to manage pension money, and our incentives weren't quite as long-term as one might as in perpetuity. But first we're going to go to Andrew Karp, where are you sitting? Oh, there you are. Great. The head of ESG Advisory and Solutions at Bank of America.
Thank you very much for being here. This is actually my first time at an event like this, so no familiar faces, but it's nice to meet everybody. I'm going to mention some themes that Nils, Stephanie, and Ambassador Cantate referenced. And certainly while we view SDG-themed bonds as an excellent tool for countries to marry their financing and sustainability goals, the lack of SDG-themed bonds in the market is really just a symptom. It's not the problem, it's a symptom. What we need in order to create financing at scale is to solve the problems that are preventing private capital from flowing to where it needs to go. And actually, there have been just this weekend there was a paper on this by the Sustainability-Linked Sovereign Debt Hub. There have been others, for example, from the Energy Transitions Commission, all talking about what some of the obstacles are to getting this market moving at scale. And they include things like lack of standardization, focus on rule of law, lack of intergovernment cooperation, the need for improvement in data and technology. But what they all come back to as a kind of primary source is the need for credit enhancement at a concessional level in order to appropriately de-risk the projects, to enable the flow of private capital and enable the sovereign to finance at an appropriate cost structure, as the ambassador referenced. I think everybody knows that the scale of this problem is significant. There are, depending on what you read, there are estimates that say that there's something between 100 billion and 300 billion of capital required per year in order for emerging market and developing economies to get to net zero by 2050. And private capital is really the only way. The only way to access the ocean is through private capital to get that money mobilized. And private capital will flow to projects that provide an adequate risk-return dynamic. And the only way to do that is to insert a layer of capital at the bottom level to enable the enable the private investor to earn the appropriate return without requiring the sovereign nation to bear an unreasonable burden of cost. Ambassador Katate referenced the fact that there are a number of nations suffering from an incredibly high debt burden that increases the cost of their debt. Those are the nations that really need access the most, and those are the nations where the capital really needs to flow in order to enable them to finance at more reasonable levels. There are lots of things that need to be achieved in order to address the scale of the problem, but risk mitigation is the critical first step.
Great, thank you so much. And so I'm hearing the way that we've always talked about this is, which is very much in line with what you just said, is first, there's real de-risking, which is a government reducing risk in their country. And that's first and foremost the most important piece of attracting foreign investment. But we also know that takes time and that it's not going to happen tomorrow in many countries. So that while countries are doing that through really good planning, at the same time, we need to think about ways to bring in public capital that's interested, that has the impact in their mind to bring this together, and we have to find a better way of doing this. But I also want to emphasize that even a ESG person is really pointing to that we're at risk and return. Because I think for many years we've all been talking about, is impact enough to bring in the private sector? Will the private sector be willing to come in and give up a premium or a discount, however which side you're looking at it for impact? And I think we're hearing around the room that that's not going to happen, at least at any scale. And so that we therefore need to, Andrew, did you want to add something? Yeah.
You'll get private capital.
Exactly, but it's not going to be at scale, yeah. So I think that we're sort of pulling a bunch of several main points coming from this discussion. And with that, we're going to go to our long-term investor. So Vito Della Erba, I'm messing names up completely, apologies. The Senior Director Investment from Global Sovereign Debt at CDPQ. And also from your perspective, do you see a difference between sovereign bonds and sovereign SDG bonds? And what is your thoughts as a long-term perspective on this thing?
Thanks a lot. I had some notes written, but I've heard a lot, so I'm going to kind of go off of what I wrote, because I think investors like CDPQ have a fiduciary responsibility within our mandate, which was set up at law to receive the market return. We cannot give up return for impact. It has to be the efficient frontier. And so if we take that as the baseline of how we invest in these markets, then the question is, what is the most productive and efficient use of our money at a specific given of risk return? We can invest in investment grade all the way down to high yield B-. And so really we have the gamut of possible investments. I heard investors are not homogeneous. They are not homogeneous, and neither are emerging market countries homogeneous. Investors have liquid investments and they have illiquid investments. I sit on the illiquid side of the business, but today I was going to give you some statistics on the liquid side because I think they're very relevant. Just so you know, CDPQ is a $300 billion public sector pension plan. We invest in emerging market sovereign bonds in both local currency and in hard currency across a universe of over 40 countries. And so we're very active. Our ability to invest in these markets is based on our view of risk return. We are liquid bond buyers in this specific mandate. When I queried the book or the portfolio for SDG sovereign bonds, we are buyers of some of these bonds already. And what I noticed was that although we held some, the absolute number was very, very low. And the reason for that is that the market is nascent and it is not well developed yet. That goes to tell you that there is an appetite for these bonds, but there's a requirement for additional marketing to institutional investors like us, to the bond side, the liquid side of the desk, because the brackish water you were referring to is on the other side of my business. I do project lending, all based on implementing IFC performance standards, ensuring that these projects are done in the right way and they have the right impact. It is a very different business with a very different skill set. And so I think marketing is the first thing, allowing these investors to understand what is necessary in order to achieve the SDGs and how these bonds do it. The other is we need a roadmap, and I think the work that UNDP and Marcos and his team are doing on integrated national financing frameworks is the key. This provides us with a roadmap that we can use to measure our approach and our advancement, and the SDG sovereign bonds are the vehicle that allows us to scale. And the last element is verification. I think the MDBs play a massive role here. They are the honest actor that the investor as well as the borrower trusts. And they can have the experience and ability and expertise to actually go in and verify that what we wanted to do is what we are doing. Thank you.
Great. So I have a quick, we're running out, we are actually just on time, but I have a quick follow-up for everybody. But first, one issue that I was thinking, sorry? Okay.
You know, suppose we use the World Bank, which works with almost all the countries, and they are the experts on money. And they put a structure in place in such a way that they are the ones maybe responsible for that structuring of the bond. And then there is an agreement of the risking. Everything is done right. Would there be also an agreement that the private sector would have a percentage of their investments going to SDGs? For example, 2%, 1%, whatever percentage. Would you be willing to say, I'm going to invest this money into the SDGs because everything's done right and you are happy with it?
I'm not sure I completely understand the structure you're suggesting, but
what I'm saying is that you're an investor. Usually you do an assessment and you do, but then it would be very difficult for maybe a government to do it for every one of them. Suppose we standardized it and then it's done right, and you are happy, because you have to assess and see if you are happy with it. Exactly the whole stream, the whole, I don't know how to say it. You are happy with the whole structuring of the program that has so many projects of SDGs, and that the risking factor is also taken into account. Would you accept, for example, to have a standard of saying, I will invest that among the total investment, the 2%, 3%, 1% will go to SDG, in terms of, would your company be able to take that kind of decision?
So thank you, Ambassador, for the question. We have been working, and I see some friendly World Bank faces here, with the World Bank for many years, trying to come up with structures that would work for our credit committees to mobilize private sector capital into not just SDG-related bonds or investments, but also NDC and National Adaptation Plan type investments to further these issues. To date, we haven't found the right structure. And so we are open to this, but in the current structure of what's available to us, it has not been possible. So we've been working on it, but we don't have an answer yet, is my response.
We have two more comments on this, but I want to throw in, as you're answering this also, so I was in markets a while ago, but frankly, and I hate to say this to my colleagues from the bank, but if we did not view like a stamp by the World Bank as that helpful, or by the IFC, So, and in fact, sometimes we just thought, oh no, it'll just slow things down, and we can't do that. So I just want to also to throw in, what your thoughts are on that as well. But Andrew, and then, yeah.
So what I would say is, to answer your question, I think if you have the right structure, and I think you could do that with the World Bank, I think you could actually have that okay. I think if you have the right structure, the assets will be there. Our experience in the market is that there are ample investors who want to invest for impact, and to the extent you can provide someone the appropriate risk return and give them the benefit of creating an impact, you wouldn't have to have the security of requiring certain percentage of commitment. The assets will be there. The assets will be there.
Thanks. And so quickly, Gavin, and then Stephanie, and then we're actually going to go on to the MDB response. So we'll give you a chance to respond.
Maybe just 2 quick additional points. On issuance, these bonds have tended to be highly oversubscribed, sometimes 5 to 10 times oversubscribed. And that just indicates the investor interest and the shift, as I mentioned before, from ESG risk management to outcomes-based investing paradigms. So I think that's a really key dynamic. The other point is on bond issuance size. And it's not necessarily true that smaller countries with smaller ticket sizes are locked out of the market. If an investor is pooling these assets together into a broader strategy, bond issuance of bonds of $25 million, $50 million become viable in a larger strategy alongside larger ticket sizes. So for smaller countries, I think the market is there.
Gavin, I can't help myself in throwing this in because, and maybe it's my, that I grew up through the market, so I have I'm always looking from the other side, the devil's advocate side. But I sometimes wonder if size is not the other piece of this, because they've been the reason we've seen a small greenium is because the sizes have been so low. The reason we've seen over demand, and that if you grow the market, that will disappear, and in fact, it's a question. And in fact, even a fear that you'll end up with a illiquidity premium on top of it, and they could become more expensive. It's just a question. But I just worry that the size thing has been because that they've been so small that we've seen the market develop so far. But Stephanie, over to you.
I just wanted to throw out one idea because Citi actually worked with World Bank Treasury very recently on a project in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese government borrowed $50 million to take wood-burning water boilers out of elementary schools to put clean water in elementary schools and reduce the GHG emissions. The bondholders actually accepted a zero-coupon bond with the yield and return coming from carbon credits that are going to be accretive to the project down the road when it's actually implemented. And so Citi operated as both the distributor but also the intermediary on the carbon credits. So I do think with the World Bank and the World Bank Treasury, there are some interesting things that can be done. It speaks to Andrew's point, though, which is, can you actually do that at scale? So I think it's a both and. We need to experiment. We need to see what we can get legs underneath and then see how the private sector can replicate some of the interesting structures that get put together.
Great, thanks. And that's a great segue for our colleague from the World Bank. So Anna Wallenstein, the Regional Director for Sustainable Development in Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. And really, do you think sovereign bonds can help catalyze financing for sustainable development? And what did you see as the role of MDBs and IFIs, as well as anything else, including in shaping the monitoring systems, as well as anything else you want to say? So.
Super. So thank you. There's been so much said, I think, as Vito said. So I'm rethinking all of my thoughts. But definitely a role for sovereign bonds and their growth. And I think definitely a critical role the World Bank can play, starting with what Stephanie said. I think some of the critical factors in really making this work that we can't forget is you need really strong strategies, you need really robust projects, and you need impact and monitoring for the bonds to be credible. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, and that's where the bank is really good. No, that's really what we do. I think there are lots of things we can talk about for sustainability-linked bonds, lots of things out there, but the important thing is getting the right structure, the right kinds of projects to be financed that are certain activities, but also match the debt capacity of government, the debt strategies of government, and their institutional capacity. And so that we really don't start to have financial solutions chasing development results rather than development results looking for the financing that will make them happen. And that's critically important. I think the INFF helps a lot, but there's still more to be done. The bank is innovating in this area. We have these new, started last year, country and climate development reports that really marry the two issues. So it's not climate change or poverty. It's really understanding how they come together. And now we're moving to implement the recommendations with really country-focused financing frameworks for those that look at where the private sector comes in, where the public sector could come in, where donor funding could come in to really marry those two and put out some options like the one that was for Vietnam, among others. And this builds on sort of that in-depth experience we have, because the bank does help build a lot of the infrastructure, the bridges that helps the water, cross the water. For example, in Colombia, we facilitated the issuance of a green bond there, the first in local currency in the region. We've helped the Bank of Costa Rica on their green taxonomy. And just now with the government of Uruguay, they issued a big sustainably linked bond. And we're backstopping it with a World Bank bond that has both the step up and step down indicators as well. So those are all really important things. A couple of you have mentioned other critical factors, and I really want to mention the importance of them for the credibility of bond issuances, but also the credibility of development results. Clear metrics, super important, and the more kinds of things you get, the broader the metrics get, and it's not just picking metrics. Those metrics need to have whole underlying systems that determine them, robust planning like they do in Indonesia, monitoring and frameworks. So those are all really important. You need periodic reporting, so not just on the financial side of the bonds, but on the non-financial side. You need independent verification. Someone mentioned that, which can be super tricky. I just came out of looking at some carbon purchases and 2 different verifications, 2 different results. So really getting that verification right is important. And then one thing no one mentioned is feedback from stakeholders, and coming from working with governments, what people think of what's going on is super important. I work in Latin America. What people think has been crucial in stability in the region. So do you hear from the people that you're aiming to help? Do they give you suggestions about how what that bond is funding could be different? Do you strengthen the communication? Because I don't think that we can underestimate the importance of sort of the politics and social acceptability of what's happening in terms of a development agenda, and then in turn the stability that will provide to investors and governments. And so that factor I think is there really important. I think the bank can help. All that underlying technical work on what happens, the scaffolding within government that creates robust systems, rule of law, but also robust systems for developing projects, monitoring them, reporting on them, working with stakeholders locally, and then also the financial innovations like Stephanie mentioned. So we've also seen other cases, for example, the Rhino bond in South Africa, where it was a bond issuance on the market, and we were able to bring in donors to actually give success fees for getting the SDG results and incent some things that wouldn't be super bankable, but to make them much more bankable. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks for all of those really excellent examples as well. So I think we're going to go on to the next panel now. We're just 2 minutes behind. Oh, one comment, so please go ahead.
One proposal, and from my experience as in the central bank as governor and minister of finance, there is one elephant in the room here, and it is risk. Once you address the issue of risk, everybody who is seated here will just respond. And it has to be done in a very systematic way. And once you do that, they have money. All the sovereign wealth funds, all the pension funds, all the money will come. But we must address the issue of risk. And once we do that, then the money that will come from the private sector would match the IDA resources, or it would exceed the IDA long-term resources. The money is there, but you have to do it in such a way that gives them assurance. And that's the only elephant in the room. Whatever we do, we can move around, but if we don't address the issue of risk, you won't get the money.
And in a sense,
I may be wrong, but that's my understanding.
And sometimes we've talked about this as there being an arbitrage, because the public sector says we think private sector is misunderstanding the risk and thinks there's more risk than there really is. So there's a difference in risk perceptions. When that happens, that's an arbitrage opportunity. That's an opportunity for the public sector to come in and guarantee those risks without overpaying, because the perceptions are different. So Gavin, quickly, yes, and then...
Really quickly, just Anna's point on stakeholder engagement I think is so critical, and the GSD UNDP announcement today on the launch of this work stream is also a call for collaboration and to invite stakeholders, private sector, public sector, civil society, indeed, to help us develop this compass or guidance for sovereigns as they head down this path. And just very quickly, there is existing guidance in the market, whether that's ICMA, UNDP, PIMCO's own guidance that will aggregate. But I think this point on stakeholder engagement is so critical.
And I'm really taking away also just the importance of learning from all the experiences we've had up till now, to think about what can we take away to standardize some of this in a way, and how can we create platforms that can really lever things up, and understanding from all of the experiences to date, like why haven't some of the earlier ones worked to scale? And it's time to reevaluate, to really reevaluate all of this and think, okay, going forward, what can we learn to be able to create platforms that can do this in a standardized way? And there are enough pension funds, et cetera, out there that I know you get brownie points at least for doing the SDGs, even if you don't actually get, right? Good. So let's move on to the next panel, though, because we are now we're a few minutes behind and 6 minutes behind. Okay. So the question is, we're going to move on to an incentive panel to think about where are the solutions now. So what incentives are needed to drive larger SDG investments to the countries who need it most, and how can INFFs assist in this endeavor? And we're going to have a series of short statements, 2 minutes, please. And we're going to start with Antti Kurhunen. I'm sorry. That's fine. That's good. Okay, it was good. Okay. Not good. Not a good morning for names. The Director of Sustainable Finance at the European Commission. So over to you. 2 minutes.
Thanks a lot, very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, first, we are lagging behind with the SDGs, so we really need to accelerate the flows to go to where they are needed. And in that sense, maybe a few words about what we try to do to help. So first, we have a global gateway investment offer, 300 billion, on which we want to work with our partner countries and to sort of bridge the investment gap that there is currently. So that's our sort of policy tool that we use. In that respect, I want to mention the INFFs. I think it's a perfect tool to really help, prioritize the national sustainable finance needs, development needs, and so we very much support that. But I think that for de-risking, which has been an issue discussed, in these times, we really need to listen and understand what the investors need. And there is the perceived risk aspect. We need to increase investor confidence. So what do we have as tools? We have a rather robust guarantee offer, 40 billion for 2021-27. It's a guarantee that we offer to the DFIs called European Fund for Sustainable Development. And so with this, we can actually do financial de-risking. We provide guarantees to the EIB, but also through what we call an open architecture to largely the European DFIs. And that is actually one of the key tools that we have for our global gateway ambition. But EFSD Plus guarantee is also very important for underpinning our efforts in the sustainable finance. So, for example, we have a big flagship now that we are trying to pull through called Global Green Bonds Initiative, where we try to promote green and sustainability-related bonds through partner countries. So we give a guarantee to DFIs so that we can actually act as an anchor investor there. But we need to think much more holistically. There's been talk about conducive environments. So we are also putting together a rather robust TA offer to ensure that we can help build the conducive enabling environment, the frameworks, the taxonomies that are needed. And so that's something that where we can certainly work together with a lot of the people around the table here. Thank you.
Excellent, very helpful. So now we're going to the Director General from Sida, Karen Jemton. I'm not going to mess up your name, though. I started this morning by messing up my boss's name, so.
Thank you, that was perfect. And I must say, I also find it difficult to say Karhunen, however that is pronounced. It's our neighbor country, so well done, Sherry. Thank you very much for moderating, and thank you everyone for being here. And that is actually my first point. We, all of us in this room, or many of us anyway, have been taking part in these kinds of discussions over many years. And this is one of the very first, very concrete discussion where everyone is really leaning in and trying to get forward with ideas. So that in itself is extremely important. So that's my first point. The other point is that I would just like to remind us all what ODA is. We have been given an instruction to work in a more catalytic way. to work to help to maybe in line with what Stephanie said, with de-risking and blending in different ways. At the same time, ODA is humanitarian aid, extremely needed. I don't think I have to remind everyone here. It's also about capacity development, building central banks or tax systems or whatever. And ODA is supporting education and health in countries. So we have to sort of be careful with our money, as all of you have to be careful with your money. The other point I would like to say around what we are handling at Sida is that we are handling a guarantee instrument which will not be counted towards ODA if there is a default event. It's counted on the Swedish state budget. Thus, we have to also be careful about the guarantee instrument with against another background. I don't need to remind all of the people in this room why that's important. But at the same time, I should also say that we have possibilities of using the guarantee instrument on sovereign debt, but we have not done it. But we are willing to lean in and see if we can do it together with the EU and together with others. So we are happy to work and to develop different kinds of instruments to work in line with de-risking and blending in an even more innovative way. And just one last point, the INFFs are an important and excellent way of sort of framing this work. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And it almost sounds like rather than that, maybe having an EU fund would be a way to get it back to ODA and off of your budget, right? So the next to Karen Isaacson, I think I got that right, from the Nordic Development Fund. And Karen, where are you? There you are.
I am on. Okay, good, very good. Thanks, that's good enough. Karin Isaksson is my name, and I am the Managing Director of the Nordic Development Fund. So I would try to address the question on how we can incentivize them based on the mandate that NDF has and also the experience that we have. We are funded by taxpayers' money from the 5 Nordic countries, and we use our balance sheet that is provided then by capital injections, and the overall aim is for us to be early stage and catalytic. So our target is to be approximately 60% in sub-Saharan Africa, so the most vulnerable countries to climate change and with the greatest need for development assistance. We have also a mandate to have 50% as adaptation finance, and we also have a mandate to have 50% as grants. The remaining 50% are provided as loans and equity. And for those reimbursable instruments, we expect a return, but we're also very, very much in there to provide high-risk investments. So how do we incentivize? For the grant money, we mainly work in the public sector, providing enabling environment, working with governments to provide the institutional infrastructure to undertake projects and investments in circular economy, for example, or renewable energy. We combine these efforts in also investing in actual concrete investment vehicles and come in with the in blended finance structures where we provide the junior equity. We have a lot of experience in working in impact investment funds. We have also some experience in working with bigger private equity funds, a recent example being the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, where NDF and KfW provided the junior equity, then also crowding in institutional investors into that structure. So learning from that, which is one of the very few examples where actually institutional investor has invested. It's emerging market, but global. That's one prerequisite. It's fund in fund, providing the bigger ticket sizes. And it's also basically it's mitigation, which is easier than adaptation. Now we want to move into capital markets instruments. We haven't done that in the past, and it's a bit presumptuous for me to say how exactly this should be done, because the market is here, and we need to listen to you. Otherwise, it's completely useless to create something that just doesn't have the appetite from the investors. But I'm happy to say that NDF is joining forces with our partners. And as of last week, actually, we have a mandate to provide grant funding together with GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and work together with the UNDP/UNCDF and EIB in creating something that we have named the Green and Resilience Debt Platform. 7 African countries has been identified, and we will follow what I already tried to describe. It's the modus operandi of NDF. We will work on the enabling environment with these countries. We will also then structure and design a investment vehicle that will provide the de-risking, the blended finance structure, and also aiming for scale. And what we've heard from the market, scale requires some kind of standardization and some also kind of liquidity. So this is our take on the challenge.
That is great, and it really underscores the need to continue these conversations, because I can imagine a whole conversation just on these sorts of platforms and comparing them and better understanding, how do we move forward in this area. So really great, and really underscoring why, as we're running out of time, we need to reconvene to continue discussing these issues. So next we're going to go to, I think it's Marcos, it's to you. So Marcos Neto from UNDP to talk about INFF facility and supporting developing countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Sherry. It's unfortunate to be the last person to take the floor. Nothing that has been written to me stands now. So let me just provide a few thoughts. Let me start with Ambassador Scatetti, question of risk, and all of this conversation, which I think is very important. For us and UNDP, and we have been directly involved in about $14 billion of thematic bond issues in the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years. A lot with Indonesia, starting all the way with the Green Sukuk, with the Uruguay, which we're involved in the framework, we're doing the verification, and the first SDG bond in the world with Mexico, which was done with UNDP. Now, we're not a financial institution, so we need the bank. Somebody got to do the financial transaction, the Citibank and the bank. We do the thematic transaction, right? We will organize the framework and we do the report, the annual reporting for Indonesia. We're doing that part in that sense. But the risk issue is important. Now, all of that we do, plus the other work that UNDP does in governance and, climate, our climate promise, with the NDCs in 120 countries, is the policy de-risk. Some of that is ex ante, some of that is doing a financial transaction. It's not enough, as Sherry said. Financial de-risk is also important, right? So that's why innovation is essential here. And the financial de-risking is important both for my colleagues here to see their risk go down and therefore they are happy and come in, but it's also important for the governments. Because part of the problem with sustainability bonds, it is expensive for the governments, right? So that the risk should also alter the credit rating of that instrument, right, to a way that becomes more affordable. So de-risking, it's important for the government as well as for the private sector. But this is why, and my dear friend Gavin and I had an interesting conversation. The innovation and sustainability, the coupons coming up and down, is an incentive for the governments to do. We have to incentivize both my friends in the private sector, but also the governments. Because governments question, why do I do a sustainability bond if I can do a vanilla bond? I'm getting no premium in the market, right? We want them to do more. So there has to be incentives both ways, not just from one way. And I'll stop here for one moment, but to say that we see this market growing. We see oversubscription. There were doubts if the Uruguay bond, because of the coupon down, we were going to sell. There was 5 billion request in there. So the market will buy a coupon down, right? We need to go up. We need to go take the scale. We need to put the date in the verification. And there is news coming from the G20. I have the pleasure to be the head of the secretariat of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And two things out of that group that we should consider. One, last year, the Bali Declaration approved a transition finance framework, which has an issue around instruments in that. Second, this year, we hope to end up with an endorsement of a few set of de-risking instruments and some recommendation of how the MDBs, what are their role on those de-risking instruments, right? So I'll stop for now in case there is more time.
So that's great, and really this underscoring that that the way to use these de-risking, or I hate the word de-risking, risk-sharing instruments, is really to link it to the SDGs. So the reason we don't just have platforms but we think about where does that money go and how do we use these instruments to link to the SDGs. Yeah, Marcos?
Sorry, I completely forgot to talk about the INFF, which is what you asked me for. So let me just say that the INFF is actually a process. You know, you're talking about stakeholder engagements. 86 countries doing INFF, and communities and private sector are involved on that process. So that stakeholder engagement is happening as part of the INFF. The other element is the INFF is an enabling environment. As the Indonesian colleagues finished the INFF, what became clear as we moved to implementation was, here's the policy reform. You can't implement it without a policy reform. So that policy de-risking is embedded in the INFFs in that sense. And then finally, and that is, you know, what I've been asking the bank and others to consider. The INFF, all of them have a price tag. You know, it's $1 trillion until 2030 in Indonesia. The pipeline is there. Please put your work behind that. You don't need it. It's there. The platform is there. The pipeline is there. The target is there. The target is there. You know, why create new things? Just, you know, we don't have $1 trillion. We can do the policy work. You can put a platform behind, mobilize with all the MDBs, the $1 trillion. So let's come together.
And the INFF also brings together debt management and this issuance of SDG bonds so that we don't make mistakes or countries don't make mistakes to help.
Thank you. Just to respond to that, I think while we talk about risk here, I think from the perspective of government, what is important is to ensure good governance in implementing that. Well, we try our best to push for good governance in all fronts, in all sectors. And I know it's not easy, lots of challenges. But like, for example, Indonesia's membership with Open Government Partnership, for example, it helps us a lot in pushing ministries, in asking subnational governments, when they deliver something, they have to be able to really prove how they do it. When they submit the data, we need to make sure that the data is accurate. So I think these are what the government needs at the moment to ensure good governance in the delivery process.
And actually, it also sends a really great signal to investors. So it's to say we are putting in place these processes to reduce risks in our countries and improve governance. So that's already a sign that in itself can help lower the cost. So Gavin, we're actually going to end with you. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. Well, Gavin, you were going to make some closing comments and thinking about how to move things.
Marcos, a thrilling close, rousing close. Thank you. A quick question for you, and perhaps some guidance. The least developed countries, can you talk about the LDCs and your work with LDCs and INFS and how the GSD, as we develop our guidance, might spare special consideration for the LDCs? Thank you.
Well, what we're starting with UNCDF and EIB and Karen on the NDF and GCF has a focus on the NDCs, right? There is a recognition. You know, 38 INFFs are on NDCs. So you can do an INFF in Sudan right now, by the way. So the INFFs are playing out on fragility, on LDCs, MICs, in all the different contexts. Now, what happened is that implementation of that financial strategy, which is the essence of INFF, in the end, it's about having a financial strategy, which is costed with the strategy, how much money comes from public and private and PPPs and so on and so forth. The policy reform on LDC, the technical assistance that we will be doing with the EU on this green bond initiative, it's harder, right? And the need for de-risking is larger, right? Because those guys, I didn't need to de-risk the Uruguay bond. Everybody went there and bought it. We don't need to de-risk the SDG bond in Indonesia. Everybody went there and bought it. But you want to do a bond in, Guinea, we're going to have to the risk, right? So the realities of the LDC from the process of the INFF, it's not much different. The implementation of financial strategy, you have a heavy dose of technical assistance, heavier, right? And from a de-risking point of view, you're going to need, that's where you really need the guarantees and the places, so we can affect the credit rating so they can feel comfortable to come in and buy.
So we have 2 minutes left. I know we have one more comment. And then, Gavin, you only have a minute left. You used it up with your question.
No, I was just saying that we are holding the LLDC conference by the United Nations in Kigali next year in June, the 18th. And I think that's where we can discuss exactly what you requested for. I really believe that one very important point maybe that we need to take into consideration is what you just mentioned. I know that in Indonesia, my friend Sri Mulyani, who is the Minister of Finance, we work together very closely. She's very disciplined in the way we do, how we implement this. There is a role of government to make sure that everything we are talking about works because it works in that country. And I think once we meet in that, because it will be led by the Secretary General and there will be so many heads of state and government, and I think if you can come and hold the same meeting in Rwanda with LDCs, with the same private sector, I think this would be very, very important for us to take a decision. Thank you so much.
That's a great idea. And we're going to talk now about next steps. There's so much that I see coming out of this that needs more discussion. The step up, step down. Last time we had a discussion, JP Morgan gave us some interesting market feedback on that, which was surprising. That anyway, but so there might be some really interesting conversations to have that we need to follow up. And with that, Gavin, I'm going to pass it to you.
Well, what a fantastic discussion. The LDC conference, that's a wonderful opportunity to explore this particular topic. I think this meeting is a compact of the willing, and there's so many market trends and dynamics in our favor. The private sector, the public sector, civil society. I couldn't be more thrilled at the opportunities to move this space forward. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.